Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leyland brothers. Whatever it is that you want to see, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. No matter whatever that happens to be, ask the Leyland brothers. Come on, me in and join in the fun. Travel all over Australia.
This week we have some more interesting letters to answer. Where do we start, Mel?
Well, the first letter takes us to Western Australia. Over here at Cervanties, which is just north of Perth, we travel along the beach to have a look at a most unusual geographical formation. It's known as the Pinnacles. And then where are we off to?
Then we go to Victoria, down here to a small island called Phillip Island, where we do a two-part story, one showing the history of Phillip Island and another one showing the wildlife. We've had dozens of letters asking to see the penguins of Phillip Island.
Well, we're heading along this track on the west coast of Western Australia, near the town of Cervanties, to answer this request, which comes from Mr. J. Holgate from Harris Park in New South Wales. And he says, my wife and I have just recently returned from a trip to Western Australia, and one of the most interesting natural phenomena we saw was the Pinnacle Desert near Cervanties, north of Perth. We found great difficulty getting out to the Pinnacles in our Corolla, and because of this problem for conventional vehicles, many people travelling to the west would not see this fantastic sight. Well, the track is fairly rough, although any conventional vehicle with plenty of clearance can make the trip. From this point on, we've got about another 6 kilometres to go before we get to the Pinnacles section. It's sometimes known as the Painted Desert, sometimes known as Tombstone Desert. Nevertheless, the trip in from here is fairly rough and you have to take it very slowly, but it's worthwhile.
Not only are the Pinnacles worthwhile when we reach them, but the trip in has its own rewards for anyone with an interest in wildflowers. This region is part of the Nambung National Park, and most of the vegetation here is as unchanged as when it was first discovered. The stark saltbush type of shrubs and occasional scraggy eucalypts are broken by splashes of colour, which brighten up the bone-shaking drive along the sandy track. Suddenly, the track emerges from the low scrub into an area of pure sand. It comes as a surprise to discover this patch of isolated desert-like dunes swept clean by wind. An eerie atmosphere seems to haunt the area, and the first impression is one of a vast cemetery. The Pinnacles stand sentinel-like throughout the wilderness region, offering one of the most surprising and bewildering spectacles of nature. It seems to defy logic that this isolated patch of sand should remain so desolate, yet surrounded by thick scrub. There is a clearly marked track which winds throughout the Pinnacles, and visitors are requested to stay on the track so as to avoid unnecessary destruction that driving elsewhere would obviously cause. It's pleasing to see that most people have complied with this request, and the place is remarkably clear of traces of man.
These pinnacles, as we call them today, were first seen by a white man over 300 years ago. It was a Dutchman by the name of Leyland. Like most of the Dutch navigators of his day, he was travelling towards Batavia, what we now call Indonesia. They used to travel eastwards and then head north, but some of them overshot the mark and ran into the west coast of Australia. this is what he did. And he saw these pinnacles from his ship through a telescope. And he thought them to be the ruins of a lost city, of some ancient civilization. And so he sent a party of men ashore in a longboat to investigate. Well, unfortunately, they couldn't get ashore because there were lots of reefs on the coast, and the sharks were pretty thick in the water, so they gave up. And for 300 years it remained a mystery as to exactly what he was referring to. In fact, I believe it was as late as 1957 that this area was actually discovered, and it then became evident what he was talking about. This was once a forest here, and these were in fact where the trees once grew. The sand came in and covered up the forest, and then torrential rains came and dissolved the seashells, the silica and all the other component parts that made this kind of cement compound, and it seeped down through the sand and clung to the roots of the trees and to the trunks of the trees. In time, the wind moved away the sand, reduced the sand level, and now we have this kind of forest of tombstones.
Some of the tombstones are in miniature, vast fields of small limestone straws, delicate protrusions of petrified roots. Tracks of lizards crisscross the soft sand between the pinnacles, the only sign of life here. In the warm glow of evening light, the entire place takes on an additional air of mystery. The awesome beauty of the setting sun painting a picture of blazing colour and long shadows, just as it has done for a million unseen sunsets.
David Green in Gladstone, Tasmania would like to see Phillip Island and asks if we could show some of the wildlife there. We're on Phillip Island and it's situated on the southern coast of Victoria at the mouth of Western Port Bay. The only road access to the island is by this bridge from San Remo, which crosses the Eastern Passage.
The first white man to see the rugged shores of Phillip Island was George Bass in 1798 when he rounded the southeastern extremity and named it Cape Woolamai. The island is named after Governor Phillip. The first settlement in the area was on Churchill Island, 600 metres off the present village of New Haven. Lieutenant Grant, during his exploration of the Bass Strait coastline, dropped anchor at Churchill Island in 1801 and planted seeds and potatoes there, the first seeds sown in Victoria. He also built a small wooden hut. The island is now owned by the Victorian Conservation Trust, and a restoration program is being undertaken before the island is open to the public. The buildings here were erected in 1870, and the spacious gardens house a cannon that came from an American Confederate warship called the Shenandoah. The cannon was given to a former mayor of Melbourne in return for his hospitality when the ship put into Melbourne for repairs in 1865. The cannon used to be fired every New Year's Eve, and according to local stories, the cannonballs were likely to be flying in any directions by the time midnight came around. A palm tree on the front lawn was reputedly cut in half on one occasion. The only access to the island is by a bridge from Phillip Island, and this relative isolation has made the island and its quiet bays an important refuge for bird life, particularly the waders. Phillip Island was settled in 1826. A major crop in its later years was chicory. Old disused kilns still dot the countryside. 80-year-old Stan McPhee told us about chicory.
Myself, for 60 years I've been connected with chicory growing. Chicory was once Phillip Island's biggest industry, and it's now the smallest. And that is because economically it's not as sound as other branches of farming, because there's a lot of hard work connected with it. And fellows nowadays don't seem to like the hard graft there is in chicory growing. Oh, they used to grow anything from 1 tonne to 2 tonne to the acre. 2 tonne was considered a very, very heavy crop in those days.
Most of the chicory now grown on the island is by Stan McPhee's family. McPhee's chicory kiln is a working museum. The old equipment used in harvesting chicory is gladly shown to visitors by Mrs. Audrey McPhee.
Called the chicory devil, and it's used to dig the chicory out, and it was designed by a chap here on the island. This is going back into the 1870s.
This chicory is only 6 weeks old and not fully matured.
This is the chicory as it's harvested, is it?
That's right, yes. And as you can see, Pat, the root of it closely resembles that of a parsnip. And when it's been brought up to the kiln, there it's washed in a long wooden trough, then elevated up onto the cutting floor, and then from there it is sliced and elevated further again up onto the drying floor. As you can see, this is the result, and it dries out very, very hard. When the dried chicory is then sent to Melbourne, there it is roasted and ground with the coffee bean.
One resident of Phillip Island that the visitor cannot fail to see is the koala.
As you can see, the koala bears on Phillip Island are very friendly. You can get quite close to them. We're looking at the chicory kiln and turned around, and coming down this tree here, which is not a gum tree, are 2 koalas.
The adult koala will consume just over 1 kilo of gum leaves a day. It is unusual to see a koala in anything other than a gum tree, but here on Phillip Island there are so many koalas that people often see them in their gardens or sitting on their cars. Last year, a koala even walked into the bank in the main street of Cowes. The staff reportedly didn't appreciate the deposit he left. The tourist industry on Phillip Island centres around the township of Cowes, where there is plenty of accommodation. If you are not lucky enough to see a koala in the main street, you might find another of nature's creatures under the Cowes jetty. The resident seal often puts on an aquatic display for the visitor. Phillip Island's main attraction lies in its golden beaches, here at Cowes or on the southern side where surfing is popular. The island's main charm lies in its variety of scenic beauty. Off Point Grant, the southwestern extremity, are the spectacular basalt rocks called the Knobbies. In a moment we will look at Phillip Island's wildlife. To begin our look at Phillip Island's wildlife, we visit Real Swamp with Charles Nancarrow, the officer in charge of wildlife management on Phillip Island for the Victorian Fisheries and Wildlife Division.
This is a natural swamp here.
It's a natural swamp. Lots of areas on Phillip Island are a natural swamp. But we do have a gate valve, a water gate, at the entrance to the swamp, so that we can maintain the level. And at times we release water, other times we block it off so that we can have the water level to suit us. No swamp should remain at a constant level. It's better to have the water level rising and falling each year, during the year. And by being able to manipulate the water level, we can maintain a more viable swamp.
Bruce Orchard, a keen Phillip Island conservationist, is helping Charles to paddle our camera boat. In 1968, Real Swamp dried out, and through the efforts of local residents and clubs, the Victorian Field and Game Association and the Island's Conservation Society, enough money was raised to add to a government grant to enable the clearing and deepening of channels in the area. Islands were built up and nest boxes were erected for the wild ducks. Now the swamp is one of the busiest reserves on the Victorian coast, and in the breeding season teems with waterfowl. Slow motion shows the grace of the white ibis. Charles Nancarrow is hoping to raise enough money to set up permanent television cameras in the swamp so the visiting public can see the birds on closed-circuit television in a visitors centre to be built on Conservation Hill near the swamp. The Royal Spoonbill is the king of Real Swamp, where some 10,000 adults and young birds live. They make a graceful scene in slow motion. Real Swamp is a tranquil place where the waterfowl are left to themselves. Hopefully one day Charles Nancarrow's television cameras will show them to everyone who visits Phillip Island. Charles, where did you get the small seal from?
Well, Mike, a surfer brought it in. One of the local surfers found it up, washed up on the beach, just offshore, or just off from Seal Rocks.
And how old would this one be?
Well, it'd only be a few weeks old. It'd be born this season. It'll still be suckling its mother.
Well, he wouldn't be able to survive on his own at all.
Certainly couldn't survive on his own, no.
People often bring injured or lost animals to Charles. It is not unusual for young seals to be washed off their breeding island called Seal Rocks, just out from the Nobbies on the southwestern extremity of Phillip Island. Normally they would die, but this little fellow is luckier than most. He's going to get a ride back to his home in the Fisheries and Wildlife's patrol boat. Although his chances of finding his mother are slim, he at least has a chance of survival. The fast patrol boat makes short work of the 20 kilometres, and Seal Rocks is soon in view. The buildings on the island are being used for a study of the seals, but at the moment no one is allowed to step ashore as it is the pupping season. The sight of humans on the island can frighten the female seals and send them rushing for the safety of the sea. In their panic they can crush their own and other babies on the way. The bull seals sit all day guarding their harems. In the late 1790s, thousands of Bass Strait seals were killed for their skins and oil. By 1850, the Australian sealing industry collapsed. The seals had been so depleted in numbers that it was uneconomical to hunt them. In 1860, only 100 Australian fur seals were counted on Seal Rocks. In recent years, the count has been around 5,000 seals at the height of the breeding season. The seals of Bass Strait are now totally protected by law. As we can't go ashore, we must liberate our young seal into the water close to the main pupping beach and hope that he can find his mother. Visitors to Phillip Island can see the seals by taking a ferry ride out to the rocks, where they can be viewed from the island with the aid of binoculars. The most famous beach on Phillip Island would be Summerland Beach, on the southern side of the island. Phillip Island's most famous attraction takes place on this beach, with a nightly homecoming of thousands of fairy penguins.
Mrs. R. Veach of Brighton, Eastern Victoria says, "It's years since we have seen the penguin parade on Phillip Island. I wonder if we could see it again on your program." Well, Mrs. Veach, we have to wait until dusk before we can see the penguins coming ashore here after they've been feeding in Bass Strait all day.
No visitor to Phillip Island should miss the penguin parade, which happens every night of the year. Like platoons of waistcoated soldiers, the fairy penguins emerge from the surf and troop up the beach past the groups of human onlookers to find their burrows in the sandhills. They always delight the children in the audience with their funny waddling walk. It is the breeding season for the fairy penguins, and they are all carrying extra food in their crops to feed their waiting chicks. They eat mainly pilchards and other small fish. Preening is essential to spread oil from a special gland above the tail into their coat for waterproofing. If you can't preen that spot yourself, it helps to have a friend. Penguins are quite exceptional birds. Their feathers are scaly and truly waterproof. They cannot fly, their forelimbs are not wings, but short, strong flippers used in swimming. They are perfectly at home in the sea and rival seals and porpoises for speed in the water. They can swim long distances underwater, but need to surface to breathe. The fairy penguin is the smallest of the 17 different species of penguin in the world. Some of the hungry chicks are as big as the adults and anxiously chase every penguin that passes. The sight of these small creatures trekking up the beach and through the sandhills has enthralled millions of visitors. Each year, well over 100,000 people from all over the world witness this remarkable scene. The birds are in no way upset by the strong floodlight that makes it possible for people to watch the penguin parade. It all began with one man bringing a carload of visitors to see the penguins by torchlight back in the 1920s. The residents of Phillip Island like to call it Victoria's Treasure Island. They certainly have a treasury of wildlife.
Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. Travel all over the countryside, ask the Leyland brothers. Whatever it is that you want to see, ask the Leylands, ask the Leylands. No matter whatever that happens to be, ask the Leyland brothers.